It is Saturday, August the 25th, 2018. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff, the Dissident Peasant. On today's show, Attica, the prison rebellion, the uprising, the spark that began the American prisoners' rights movement. We'll talk about what happened on September the 9th, 1971 in Attica, New York. Just a reminder that today's show is brought to you by two sponsors. First group of sponsors I want to thank is a group of sponsors at patreon.com/dissidentpeasant. You can go there too, join them. Become a recurring patron. Support my work and research. I really appreciate it. The other sponsor of today's show is prison labor. Prison labor makes possible the world that we live in. There are some jobs in America, depending on where you live, you cannot do unless you get locked up in prison. So I just want to take a moment to recognize people in prison, some, most even, who don't deserve to be there, who are treated unconscionably, and who are on a strike right now in 2018. I urge you all to support the efforts of prisoners and their demands however you can. And we'll talk more about that at the end of the show. The Attica Prison Uprising, which I'd rather not refer to as the Attica Prison Riot, and will do my best not to, occurred on September the 9th, 1971 in Attica, New York, about 30 miles from Buffalo. About 1,000 or so inmates, about half the prisoners, took staff and guards as hostages to protest their conditions and agitate for greater political and social freedoms. It would end in blood, as these things often do, with the wielders of overwhelming power found upon the side of Uncle Sam, and the use of that power would prove to be so alluring it would result in the forces of order slaughtering unarmed men, prisoner and hostage alike. But before we get all that, you know me, always striving to be thorough. Let's start with a bit of background. First off, you should know by this time the federal law enforcement is a decade and a half into its illegal COINTELPRO regime. That's a portmanteau of counterintelligence program. This was the program designed to infiltrate and disrupt various anti-establishment and radical organizations of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. Black Panthers, civil rights attorneys, famous black athletes and musicians, including the greatest American composer of all time, Duke Ellington, communists, socialists, anti-Vietnam War activists, students for a democratic society, perhaps most famously Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself. All of these groups and people were surrounded with agents and informants. And by 1971, a fair number of people who were not, if actual political prisoners, then prisoners with a political consciousness, were being incarcerated as a result of these federal and state-assisted machinations. Just months before Attica, a group of 8 plucky leftist radicals from the Citizens Commission to Investigate the FBI broke into an office building in Pennsylvania, stole 1,000 documents, and successfully evaded capture by the just absolutely stellar detective skills of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's 200 agents on the case. The Washington Post ran a front-page story that March of 71 on these anonymously sent and received documents, which revealed numerous illegalities and unconstitutional activities by the FBI. This program would eventually be exposed through their efforts and the efforts of others as nothing less than a criminal enterprise of theft, fraud, and even assassination. perpetrated by the nation's premier federal law enforcement body. It was a raw time in 71, and it was one ripe with opportunities to contemplate mortality and political change. By 1971, Bobby Kennedy, the Kent State protesters, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Fred Hampton, so many other leaders would already be dead. But as far as Attica goes, what were the conditions for a prisoner at Attica? And who were these prisoners? Well, their conditions was bad. Their mail was read and intercepted all the time. Imagine, if you please, being beaten or tortured by a prison guard. Well, you might think to send a letter to a lawyer, a judge, or a parole board. It would never arrive. The food was intolerable. The medical care was basically non-existent. Forced labor was a thing. It still is. Joseph Hayden, one of the prisoners, would say, quote, "Attica was a stark place. You only had an hour a day of recreation, and the rest of the time it was something out of the 1870s. End quote. 54% of the inmates were black, while 100% of the guards were white, and racial epithets and insults were incredibly common. Most prisoners were there as a result of something called plea bargains. Now, the report on the Joint Legislative Committee on Crime in New York, itself a state body, would describe these bargains thusly, quote, "The final climactic act in the plea bargaining procedure is a charade, which in itself has aspects of dishonesty which rival the original crime in many instances. The accused is made to assert publicly his guilt on a specific crime, which in many cases he has not committed. In some cases he pleads guilty to a non-existing crime. He must further indicate that he is entering his plea freely, and that he is not doing so because of any promises made to him." End quote. The average time of a parole hearing for a prisoner at Attica in 1971 was 5.9 minutes. This included the reading of their file and any deliberation among the members of the parole board. Decisions were handed down with no explanation. As I mentioned previously, doubtless among the inmates were some that were classic political prisoners, framed for crimes because of their political activities or simply convicted of crimes committed in the course thereof. A larger group, no doubt, were people who may have committed crimes in the past out of desperation or opportunity and not related to their politics, but whose contact with the Marxists, Socialists, Radical Democrats, Black Panthers, these groups in prison, will result in them becoming political prisoners in a certain sense, punished in prison by guards who would frequently lie about prison infractions by these politically conscious inmates. Which brings us to Comrade George. Comrade George was not at Attica, but George Lester Jackson, the prisoner and best-selling Maoist author, originally in prison for armed robbery but now charged with the murder of a guard some months before, selective retaliation for the murder of 3 prisoners some months before that by another guard. Well, Comrade George had had enough of this shit. 3 days prior to the start of his murder trial for that guard, in August 1971, he produced a gun from his hair and ordered a guard to open all the cells in San Quentin, which was done. Hostages were taken and lives too, ultimately. 3 guards, 2 prisoners, and Jackson would all lose their lives. He was just shy of his 30th birthday and had spent over a decade incarcerated for stealing $70 from a gas station, most of it in solitary confinement. Or so goes the story from the state. It's difficult to tell exactly what happened in August of 1971 with George Jackson at San Quentin, but later disclosures and research have suggested a government plot to kill Jackson in prison, not for anything he did, but for everything he said and wrote and believed. And the government narrative has been full of holes from the start, according to Eric Mann in his book Comrade George's Investigation. Nonetheless, his death sparked a chain reaction with prisoners in San Jose, Dallas, Boston, New Jersey, and, yes, Attica, all erupting in rebellion. At Attica, a prisoner-led sociology class had already begun organizing and coordinating action among prisoners. In July, a list of demands was issued and responded to in a videotape by a state official. How nice. No other action on their demands was taken. Days prior to the riot, or the rebellion, if you will, all but a few prisoners refused to eat lunch or dinner in protest over the killing of George Jackson. It was upon this tense atmosphere the sun waited to dawn over the Attica State Correctional Facility on September 9th, 1971. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think happened to the best of my ability. I have to rely in some part upon reports of the government, and I am skeptical of reports from the government regarding anything and everything having to do with Attica, for reasons that should become clear later, if they aren't already. But, basically, how this all started is the day before, according to one inmate interview I saw anyway. There was a bit of a sparring match in the yard between a black guy and a white guy from opposing football teams. It wasn't a real fight even, but guards intervened anyway, and rumor had it that the guard doing the breaking up of the fight claimed assault from one of the prisoners, and a prisoner from 5 Company was going to be isolated. At 4:20 a.m., nice, roll call was held for that 5 Company, and a few inmates decided to take a tiny action in protest. They walked back towards their cells and freed their isolated cellmate, rejoined the rest of the 5 Company, and all went to breakfast together. The bigwigs upstairs at the prison, upon hearing what happened, were planning to deny recreation to the prisoners of 5 Company in retaliation. A door in the path of that company from breakfast into the yard was duly locked, but the officer with the charge of 5 Company was not informed. After breakfast, this officer led his company into a narrow passageway to find the door locked, which puzzled both him and the prisoners. This puzzlement among the inmates began to quickly turn to fear. George Jackson was dead. The brutality and perfidy of the guards well known. The prisoners were afraid this was a setup, that some of them might be killed, others sadistically tortured for this small act of defiance of freeing their comrade from isolation. If these people killed George Jackson, what would they do to them, who weren't even best-selling authors? More officers arrived to escort 5 Company back to their cells, and the prisoners snapped. They turned on these officers. They overpowered them, they busted through the door to the yard, and took it. From this base, about 1,000 prisoners would ultimately occupy the prison, take hostages, and issue a list of 27 demands. Or 28, according to some counts. Their manifesto is not long. I won't read the whole thing. But the beginning's quite good, and I quote it now. Quote, "We, the men of Attica Prison, have been committed to the New York State Department of Corrections by the people of society for the purpose of correcting what has been deemed as social errors in behavior. Errors which have classified us as socially unacceptable until reprogrammed with new values, and more thorough understanding as to our values and responsibilities as members of the outside community. The Attica Prison Program, in its structure and conditions, have been enslaved on the pages of this manifesto of demands with the blood, sweat, and tears of the inmates of this prison. The program which we are submitted to under the facade of rehabilitation are relative to the ancient stupidity of pouring water on a drowning man, inasmuch as we are treated for our hostilities by our program administrators with their hostility as medication. In our efforts to comprehend on a feeling level an existence contrary to violence, we are confronted by our captors with what is fair and just. We are victimized by the exploitation and the denial of the celebrated due process of law. In our peaceful efforts to assemble in dissent as provided under this nation's U.S. Constitution, we are in turn murdered, brutalized, and framed on various criminal charges because we seek the rights and privileges of all American people. In our effort to intellectually expand in keeping with the outside world through all category of news media, we are systematically restricted and punitively remanded to isolation status when we insist on our human rights to the wisdom of awareness. End quote. Now, I won't read each of the 27 demands that follow, though I urge you to seek them out and find them if you are interested. Briefly, though, I will tell you basically everything they wanted. The prisoners demanded numerous parole hearing reforms, changes in medical staff, policy and procedure, increased visitation rights, an end to segregation based on political beliefs, the end to forced labor as a condition of good behavior, or the retaliation against prisoners refusing to labor for pennies a day, an end to the political censorship of reading materials. They demanded an end to racial persecution, a prevailing wage for the jobs they did do, an 8-hour workday, the right to unionize, the prosecution of correctional officers for cruel and unusual punishments, an end to corporal punishment, 3 lawyers to serve as full-time public attorneys for the inmates, workers' comp, vocational training, and unions, an annual accounting of the recreational fund of the prison and some share of power in the spending of those funds, an end to the practice of intentionally agitating racial tensions among prisoners by staff, the right to be present during searches of their cells, an end to life sentences, better food, sanitary conditions, and the rule of law within the prison, and not the arbitrary decisions of a warden. Finally, amnesty for the uprising for anyone and everyone who participated, which is the 28th demand, according to some counts. Now, I don't know about you, but basically none of that seems unreasonable to me. Furthermore, many of these demands are being echoed as I record this among the multi-state prison strikers in the United States today. An end to coerced labor for pennies or nothing, more and better reading materials, visitation rights, complaints about the punitive use of solitary and the food. These demands, among others, are all being renewed today because they were not met in 1971. So who were the leaders of this Attica Uprising? Well, it was a chaotic and brief affair, and not one that left much time for election and deliberation, but a few names do stand out. Frank Smith, known as Big Black, was made chief of security during the operation. It was his intervention, among others, specifically black Muslims, that quickly put a stop to the mistreatment of any hostages, prisoners, or observers who were present in the prison during the action. In fact, the prisoners would ultimately take only 5 lives during the entire course of their rebellion. 1 guard who was fatally injured at the start in the tunnel, and 4 prisoners who were subjected to killings of retaliation. Partly because of the efforts of prisoners like Big Black, Tom Wicker, the New York Times columnist invited to the prison as an observer, would write, quote, "The racial harmony that prevailed among the prisoners, it was absolutely astonishing. That prison yard was the first place I have ever seen where there was no racism." End quote. Another black prisoner would describe it thus, quote, "I never thought whites could really get it on, but I can't tell you what the yard was like. I actually cried. It was so close. Everyone so together." End quote. Big Black would not be among those killed when the rebellion was put down. Instead, his fate would involve sadistic torture post-action, perhaps more so than any single other prisoner at Attica. Guards beat him. They burned him with cigarettes, hot shell casings, repeatedly threatened to castrate him. He'd be charged with, among other crimes, 34 counts of kidnapping as the quote-unquote leader of the uprising, but these charges would eventually be dropped. It was Frank Big Black Smith who kept the memory of Attica alive in court proceedings for decades, for which posterity should be grateful. He would die a free man in 2004 at the age of 71 of cancer, with a history as a paralegal on the Attica case, a substance abuse counselor, and a really fucking cool guy. Elliot James Barkley, known by the pseudonym L.D. during negotiations and posthumously, was a 21-year-old black guy in jail for violating his parole by driving without a license. His original crime was forging and cashing a money order when he was 18 for $124.60. Truly a heinous crime. He was actually only a few days from release when the rebellion took place. His voice as an orator during the uprising has become one of the most iconic, as it was emblematic of the mood, and he was a tremendous morale boost among the prisoners. I play a bit for you now.
We are men. We are not beasts, and we do not intend to be driven or beaten as such. The entire prison populace has set forth to change forever the ruthless brutalization and disregard for the lives of the prisoners here and throughout the United States. What has happened here but the sound before the fury of those who are oppressed.
After the retaking of the prison, prisoners would testify to hearing the guards call out for Barkley by name among the surrenderers. An observer present, Assemblyman Arthur Eve, would testify that Barkley was alive post-surrender. Nonetheless, he would die via gunshot to the back from those guards. On the other side, Governor Rockefeller, the so-called liberal Republican of New York, stated that he agreed to most of the prisoners' demands, but refused to grant amnesty for the uprising, stating that he was not empowered to do so, but eventually giving up the game when forced to admit that even if he thought he could grant amnesty to the prisoners, he would never do so. This refusal to grant amnesty, even while seeming agreeable to the prisoners, smelled like a trap and not a concession at all. It was a trap and not a concession at all. The forces of that same Governor Rockefeller, who refused to show up at the prison, despite the stalled negotiations, told the prisoners' representatives that he wanted to continue talking, even as National Guard troops and law enforcement prepared to storm the prison in a military operation. 1,000 armed men would assault Attica with shotguns, automatic rifles, carbines, submachine guns. Included among the casings found at Attica post-assault were ammunition that was literally banned by the United States for use in war because of its indiscriminate killing abilities. 31 prisoners, most of whom were lying on the ground in a giant opaque cloud of tear gas, would be killed as a result of this assault, as well as 9 guard hostages. Government officials gave quotes to reporters post-assault attesting to the slashed throats of hostages and the brutality of the prisoners, which set the stage for violent torture and reprisal among the inmates post-rebellion. All this was false, of course, despite the most strenuous efforts of some at intimidating the medical examiner doing the autopsies and suppressing his conclusions, among other nasty efforts. The assault and the reprisals among the prisoners would be found by the government commission itself to be unacceptable. But I urge you, dear listener, to resist the feeling that this sort of behavior among the forces of order in 1971 United States, the indiscriminate killing, the lying, the torture, was somehow exceptional or randomized. The suppression at Attica was the consequence of a mindset that has a fundamentally dark view of the purpose of prisons. Rehabilitation, redemption, social readjustment. These phrases appeared then and appear now, in the literature and discourse surrounding the carceral state. And then as now, it's all bullshit. Torturing prisoners who perform slave labor is what the system is for. Warehousing people and extracting value from them is what the system is for. A place to send non-white folk who are too free-thinking for the comfortable existence of white people is what the system is for. Post-raid, after shooting Elliot James Barkley in the back, correctional officers began marking some prisoners with chalk. When they were finished, these prisoners were forced to walk a gauntlet of men armed with clubs to pass under the yoke, where their stripped bodies would receive beatings the whole way back inside. Such activities were the point, and are the point today, of prisons in the United States of America. Earlier, I quoted the manifesto, which spoke of the facade of rehabilitation and the need to, rehabilitate the concept of rehabilitation from one of retribution to one of humanity. Directly following the retaking of the prison, the forces of order made clear they did not agree. Have those forces become more agreeable since then? Well, no. The New York State Commissioner of Prisons wasn't even changed. The little prisoner organized support groups that existed at Attica once were gone. Guards and soldiers who killed or tortured or brutalized inmates continued to be supported and protected. The decades that followed continued to invoke law and order and being tough on crime in the political discourse. This was the age of California and other states' three strikes laws and Hillary Clinton's super predators. Public opinion in the United States has improved slightly on questions related to prisoners. Most Americans do have a great deal more desire to protect nonviolent drug offenders than they used to, but sympathy for or concern with the fate of the shoplifter, the drunken brawler, the desperate woman who forges a check, these all remain elusive. Governor Rockefeller, of course, would go on to become the Vice President of the United States after this, under Gerald Ford, and receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But not before leaving his state behind with some draconian drug sentencing laws passed. Solitary confinement in Attica and other places has evolved, become widespread, despite decades of research showing it results in psychiatric symptoms in the hardiest and most well-adjusted of people. Because prison is designed to hurt you and break you, not heal you or make you better. So, well then, what of the legacy of Attica? If reform was shallow, isolated, or non-existent, basically. Well, for one, we must, I think, take a moment to recognize the sheer bravery and resilience of prison strikers at Attica and their ideological descendants striking today. The whole point of being a prisoner is to be made to feel powerless, to be trained to submit unflinchingly and continuously to authority, to disrupt this in any way, no matter how small, whether you refuse to work or to eat, or you smuggle some video out, or maybe even just walk back towards your cells to grab an unjustly isolated prisoner before breakfast in 1971, is incredibly dangerous, perhaps even mortally so. The brothers at Attica had a saying, quote, "Attica is all of us," end quote. The humane treatment of prisoners is not just a matter of mercy or justice or morality, but of general urgency to the broader public. The number of Americans in prison or jail has only skyrocketed since Attica. The same systems of punishment and pain that were developed for the worst of the worst or whatever have already begun to be turned on other groups of society, The same violent men of the state have turned their guns upon Black Lives Matter, upon Antifa, upon Occupy. Even as fascists and fascist-adjacent tools increasingly openly organize and evangelize in the United States. Remembering Attica and other prisoner rights movements isn't just a matter of celebrating the bravery and echoing the demands of those prisoners. It's about us. There's a link in this episode description at distantpeasant.com to the 2018 prison strike website to learn how you can contribute money or other efforts to support striking prisoners. Please check it out if you'd like. Okay, I'll hit you all up next week.